The wind moved gently across the open plains as Luke Carson walked along the fence line of his lonely ranch. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the land with soft golden light. Dust swirled around his boots and his horse followed him quietly, its hooves sinking into the dry earth. For 20 long years, Luke had lived here alone with only the land, the animals, and his thoughts for company. His days followed a simple rhythm: work, eat, sleep, repeat. He spoke so little that sometimes he forgot the sound of his own voice. He hadn't always been this way. Once, Luke had been the kind of man people liked to be around. He used to play the guitar at the saloon on Saturday nights. He'd dance with a girl, laugh with his friends, and ride home under the stars. But all that changed the year Mary died. She was the only woman he had ever truly loved, and her sudden illness had taken her before their wedding day. When she was gone, something inside him had broken quietly. He didn't cry or shout. He just stopped living like a man with hope. After her death, Luke sold his small home near town and moved far out, where the hills met the horizon. He built himself a small wooden cabin and planted no flowers around it. He didn't want beauty. He wanted silence. People from town sometimes rode by to check on him, but he never stayed long in conversation. The years passed and the world around him changed. Families came and went, children grew up, and new ranchers settled nearby. But Luke stayed the same. Even the seasons seemed to move around him, leaving him untouched. Each morning he rose before sunrise, lit his small stove, and brewed a pot of coffee that tasted mostly like ashes. His old dog, Rusty, would wag its tail, waiting for the same quiet breakfast every day. Luke would then saddle his horse, Buck, and ride across the land, checking fences or herding cattle. He didn't hurry, he had nowhere to go. His eyes often drifted toward the open horizon, where once he had dreamed of building a future with someone. Those dreams were gone now, carried away by time and dust. Sometimes on quiet evenings he would sit outside his cabin and stare at the stars. He'd remember the sound of Mary's laughter and the way she had braided her hair. He would close his eyes and almost imagine her voice saying his name again. But when he opened his eyes, there was only the cold night wind. He had learned to live with it. The emptiness had become a part of him, like a scar that never fully healed. The people in town spoke kindly of him, though many pitied his loneliness. "He's a good man," they'd say. "Just lost too much too soon." A few young men tried to get him to come to town for gatherings or church suppers, but Luke always refused politely. He told himself that he was fine, that he didn't need anyone. But deep down, he knew there was a part of him that still ached quietly. A part that wished someone would look at him not with pity, but with warmth. Then, one bright spring morning, something unexpected happened. Luke was repairing a broken gate near the front of his land when he heard the sound of a wagon coming down the dusty road. It was rare for anyone to visit his place. He wiped his hands on his shirt and looked up. The wagon came closer, the horses trotting steadily. Sitting on the driver's bench was a young woman in a pale blue dress, her hat tied under her chin. Her hair caught the sunlight, glowing like wheat. She pulled the wagon to a stop and called out, "Morning, Mr. Carson." Her voice was cheerful and clear. Luke hadn't heard someone say his name with such life in years. He walked closer, unsure what to say. "Morning," he answered softly. His voice sounded rough from disuse. The young woman smiled brightly. "I'm Clara Turner. My father's ranch is over the ridge. We brought extra hay for some of the older ranchers who might need it." She pointed to the wagon full of hay bundles. "Thought you could use some." Luke nodded slowly. "That's mighty kind of you, Miss Turner. I can pay for it." She shook her head. "No need. Pa says you've helped folks plenty before. This one's on us." She jumped down from the wagon before he could protest and began helping unload the hay. Luke hesitated for a moment, then joined her. For the first time in years, he worked beside someone who spoke and laughed. She talked about the coming fair, about the new family settling in town, about her father's stubborn old horse. Her words filled the empty space around him, and he found himself listening without wanting to stop. When the last bundle was off the wagon, she brushed her hands and looked at him with playful eyes. "You sure you remember how to smile, Mr. Carson?" she teased. Luke blinked, surprised by her boldness. Then, to his own surprise, he felt the corner of his mouth lift slightly. "Maybe I forgot how," he said quietly. "Well, that's all right," she said with a grin. "You'll remember someday." Then she climbed back onto her wagon, gave him a wave, and rode off down the dirt road, leaving a small trail of dust and a larger silence behind her. Luke stood there long after she was gone, staring at the road. Something inside him felt strange, like the air had changed. The world around him looked the same, yet different somehow. The wind felt warmer, the sky a little brighter. He didn't know why, but her visit had left a mark on him. That night, as he sat by the fire, he caught himself thinking about her laughter. It echoed softly in his mind, breaking through the stillness of his cabin. He picked up his old guitar, covered with dust, and strummed a few rusty notes. It sounded rough, but it reminded him that once he had known music. He smiled faintly, realizing how long it had been since he had even tried. Over the next few days, Luke went about his chores, but the rhythm of his life had changed. When he rode to check the fences, he glanced toward the Turner Ranch in the distance. When he sat by his fire, he caught himself listening for the sound of a wagon. He told himself it didn't mean anything, she was just being kind. But kindness had become rare in his life, and it had warmed something long frozen inside him. Even Rusty seemed to notice the difference. The old dog wagged his tail more, sensing the lighter step in his master's walk. Luke still spoke little, but when he did, his tone carried less weight. He found himself humming a tune he didn't remember learning. It was small, simple, but it made the long days feel shorter. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned red, Luke looked out across his land and whispered quietly to himself, "Maybe life ain't done with me yet." The wind carried his words away, but deep down, he knew he had finally said something true. He didn't know if Clara would ever come again, or if she even remembered the quiet man she met on the road, but her visit had reminded him that he was still part of the living world. Somewhere out there beyond the hills, laughter still existed, music still played, and maybe, just maybe, hope could return to an old cowboy's heart. And so, for the first time in 20 years, Luke didn't dread the morning. He went to bed that night with a soft smile and a thought that stayed with him even in his dreams. That sometimes, it only takes one unexpected voice to remind a lonely man that he's still alive. The days after Clara's visit passed slowly, yet something felt different on Luke Carson's ranch. The wind still moved through the grass, the horses still grazed, and the sun still rose the same way. But there was a new rhythm in Luke's life now. Every time he passed the front gate, he remembered her voice calling, "Morning, Mr. Carson." He hadn't realized how much he missed the sound of another person's laughter until she brought it back. A week later, as Luke was feeding the horses, he heard the familiar sound of a wagon rolling up again. His heart gave a strange, quick beat. When he looked up, there she was, Clara Turner, sitting on the wagon with a basket in her lap. Her blue dress fluttered in the breeze, and her smile was just as bright as before. "Good morning again, Mr. Carson," she called cheerfully. Luke wiped his hands on his trousers and walked toward her. "Morning, Miss Turner," he said quietly. "Didn't expect you today." Clara hopped down, holding the basket. "I was passing by after visiting the Miller place. Thought you might need some eggs and milk." She held the basket toward him. Inside were fresh eggs, bread, and a jar of honey. "You didn't have to do that," Luke said, his voice almost shy. "I know," she said with a smile, "but I wanted to." Luke hesitated, then took the basket. "Thank you." "You're kind." Clara looked around at the ranch. "You've got a nice place here, Mr. Carson. Big, quiet, but maybe a little too quiet." He chuckled softly. "That's how I like it." She raised an eyebrow playfully. "Or maybe that's just what you tell yourself." Luke didn't answer. He wasn't used to someone challenging him like that. Most people in town just nodded politely and left him alone. But Clara talked to him like she saw something more, a man who still had life left in him. That day she stayed longer. They talked as she helped him gather firewood and feed the chickens. She told him stories about her childhood, about how her father taught her to ride horses when she was barely tall enough to reach the saddle. Luke listened, sometimes smiling, sometimes just quietly enjoying her company. When the sun began to set, Clara dusted off her dress and said, "Well, I better head home before Pa sends a search party." Luke nodded and helped her onto the wagon. "Thank you for the visit," he said softly. She grinned. "Don't thank me yet. I might make a habit of stopping by." As the wagon rolled away, Luke stood by the gate just as he had before. He watched her disappear down the dusty road, a small smile resting on his lips. The silence after her departure didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive, like something waiting to happen. Over the next few weeks, Clara kept her word. Sometimes she stopped by with food, sometimes just to talk. Once, she brought a small plant and placed it near his porch. "Every home needs something green," she said. Luke had almost forgotten what color felt like until then. She had a way of bringing warmth wherever she went. Even Rusty, Luke's old dog, wagged his tail wildly whenever she came. "He likes you," Luke said one day. "Animals know good hearts," Clara replied with a wink. As days turned into months, their friendship grew naturally. They didn't need fancy words or promises. They just enjoyed being around each other. Luke found himself waiting for her visits, though he never admitted it out loud. Sometimes he'd prepare fresh coffee before she arrived, pretending it was just part of his daily routine. Clara, on her side, seemed to enjoy teasing him gently. She often said, "You know, Mr. Carson, I think you're not half as grumpy as people say." Luke would smile faintly. "Who says I'm grumpy?" "Everyone," she replied with a laugh. "But I think they're wrong." He'd shake his head, pretending not to care, but inside he felt something warm stir. For the first time in years, he looked forward to each day. One evening, when she visited to bring him a new batch of eggs, the sun dipped low, casting golden light through the barn's open door. Clara helped him fix a saddle strap that had worn out. As she worked, she noticed Luke's hands trembling slightly. "You've been alone too long, haven't you?" she asked softly, not looking up. Luke froze, unsure how to answer. His throat tightened. "I guess I got used to it," he said quietly. Clara nodded slowly. "Used to it doesn't mean you like it." The silence between them grew gentle but deep. Luke wanted to speak, to explain how life had been empty since Mary's passing, but the words wouldn't come. So he just stood there listening to the creak of the barn and the soft sound of Clara's voice humming as she worked. After that evening, Luke couldn't stop thinking about what she said. It followed him through every chore, every quiet night. He realized how true her words were. He hadn't liked being alone. He had simply learned to survive it. One afternoon, as he rode toward town to buy supplies, he saw Clara in the distance, riding her horse along the ridge. She waved when she saw him, her laughter carried by the wind. Luke felt his heart lift in a way he hadn't felt in 20 years. He raised his hand to wave back, surprised by how natural it felt. In town, people began to notice the change in him. The storekeeper joked, "You're smiling more these days, Luke, that's new." Luke tried to hide his grin. "Maybe the weather's just better." The storekeeper chuckled. "Or maybe someone's brightened it up for you." Luke didn't answer, but his silence gave away the truth. That evening, as he returned to the ranch, he found a folded note left on his porch. The handwriting was neat and feminine. "Thanks for fixing my father's gate last week. He says you're stronger than 3 ranch hands put together. Don't work too hard." Luke read the note 3 times before placing it carefully inside a small wooden box on his desk. That night, he slept better than he had in years. Days turned into weeks, and their friendship deepened. They shared small talks about life, the weather, and dreams they once had. Clara confessed she wanted to build her own stable one day and train horses. Luke listened with pride in his eyes, admiring her spirit. But deep down, he was scared. Scared of hoping again. Scared that life might take something from him if he reached out. He often told himself she was just being kind, nothing more. Yet every time she smiled at him, that quiet wall around his heart grew weaker. One day, Clara arrived later than usual. The sky was already turning pink when she reached his ranch. "Sorry I'm late," she said breathlessly. "I was helping Pa with the cattle." Luke nodded, hiding his relief. "I was starting to think you weren't coming." She laughed softly. "And miss my favorite Cowboys coffee?" "Never." That evening, they sat on the porch watching the sky turn from gold to violet. Neither spoke much. The silence between them felt peaceful, not lonely. Clara leaned back in her chair and said, "You know, Mr. Carson, sometimes I think people forget how to live when they stop believing they deserve happiness." Luke looked at her, his heart heavy with understanding. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but sometimes it's easier not to hope." Clara turned to him and said, "Then maybe someone needs to remind you how." Her words stayed with him long after she left. He didn't know what was happening between them, but he knew one thing for sure. The walls he had built over 20 lonely years were beginning to crack. And though Luke didn't yet realize it, Clara had already brought something back into his life that he thought he'd lost forever: the courage to feel alive again. The summer came early that year, hotter than usual, and the land began to dry faster than Luke could remember. The grass near the creek turned yellow, the soil cracked, and the wind carried the smell of dust instead of wildflowers. Luke woke earlier than usual each morning, checking on his horses and the small herd of cattle he still kept. Life had taught him to handle hardship quietly, but this summer he wasn't facing it alone anymore. Clara often rode over to help, bringing water barrels or leading her father's ranch hands to share work. Each time she came, the dull weight in Luke's heart grew lighter. He had started to talk more, even laugh sometimes, and his neighbors began to notice. "That Turner girl's got you working like a young man again," one of them teased. Luke only smiled but said nothing. Deep inside he knew it was true. Then one afternoon the sky changed. Heavy clouds gathered fast over the horizon. The air grew thick and still, and the horses started pacing nervously in their pens. Luke looked up, sensing something was wrong. It wasn't just another summer rain. This was going to be a storm, a bad one. By sunset, the wind had turned wild, bending the trees. The first drops of rain fell hard, drumming against the roof of the barn. Luke quickly moved his animals inside and bolted the doors. Just as he finished, he saw something through the sheets of rain. 2 riders struggling to cross the flooded low ground near the river. Even through the storm, he recognized Clara's bay mare. His heart pounded. Without thinking twice, he grabbed his coat and ran for his horse. "Come on, Buck," he shouted over the thunder. The animal hesitated but obeyed. Luke rode hard into the storm, the wind slapping rain across his face. The water along the road was already rising, turning the dirt into thick mud. When he reached the river bend, he found Clara's wagon stuck deep in the mud. The wheels wouldn't move. Clara was trying to pull on the reins while her father, Mr. Turner, shouted directions. But Luke could see the older man was hurt. One arm hung uselessly by his side. "Clara," Luke shouted, dismounting and running toward her. "You need to get out of here." She turned, soaked to the bone but relieved to see him. "Pa's hurt. The wagon won't move." Luke took one quick look at the situation. The water was rising fast, swirling around the wagon wheels. He unhooked the horses first, calming them with firm words. Then he lifted Mr. Turner carefully out of the wagon, carrying him toward higher ground. Clara followed, slipping in the mud but refusing to leave her father's side. The thunder roared above them and lightning flashed across the dark sky. Luke helped Clara build a small shelter under a cluster of tall rocks. "We'll wait it out here," he said, trying to sound calm. Mr. Turner was breathing heavily, his face pale from pain. Clara tore a piece of her skirt to wrap his injured arm. Her hands trembled, but her voice stayed steady. "You'll be all right, Pa. Just stay with us." Luke knelt beside them. "You did good bringing him this far," he said gently. "Let me take it from here." They stayed huddled together as the storm raged through the night. Rain poured like sheets of glass, thunder shaking the ground. Luke kept the fire going inside the small rock shelter, shielding Clara and her father from the worst of the wind. When Mr. Turner finally fell asleep, Clara looked at Luke with weary eyes. "You came for us," she said softly. Luke nodded. Couldn't do anything else. For a while, neither spoke. The only sounds were the fire crackling and the rain beating outside. Then Clara noticed a framed picture on Luke's saddlebag, a faded photograph of a young woman with kind eyes. She picked it up gently. "She was beautiful," she whispered. Luke's voice was quiet when he answered. "Her name was Mary. We were supposed to be married 20 years ago." Clara looked at him, her expression full of empathy. "I'm sorry." Luke stared into the fire. "I stopped living after she passed. Thought I could hide from life if I stayed out here, but turns out time don't wait for anyone." She watched him for a long moment, her eyes soft. "Maybe she wouldn't want you to keep trying to live without her," Clara said quietly. "Maybe she'd want you to find a reason to live again." Luke turned his head slowly to look at her. Her words struck him deeper than she could know. "You sound a lot like her," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." The night dragged on, but the storm slowly began to fade. By morning, the sky cleared, painted with soft colors of dawn. The ground was soaked and the air smelled of wet earth. Luke saddled his horse and helped Clara lift her father onto it. They rode back carefully toward her ranch, moving slowly through the muddy road. When they reached the Turner place, her father insisted Luke stay until the doctor came. Clara cooked breakfast for everyone, even though she was tired. Luke watched her move around the kitchen with quiet grace. Every small action she took seemed to fill the house with life. Mr. Turner, resting in bed, called out to Luke, "You saved us, son." "Don't think I'll forget that." Luke shook his head. Anyone would have done the same. But Clara's father smiled knowingly. No, not anyone. Later that day, when the doctor left and the ranch calmed down, Clara walked with Luke to the gate. The sunlight caught her hair, making it shine like gold. "You should rest too," she said gently. "You look like you haven't slept." He smiled a little. "I've had worse nights," she tilted her head. "Still, thank you. For everything," Luke hesitated. "You don't have to thank me. I just did what felt right." Clara looked at him for a moment and said softly, "Maybe that's what you've been missing. Luke, doing what feels right instead of what feels safe." Her words stayed with him as he rode back home. That evening, he sat outside his cabin and watched the sky. The world felt different. It wasn't just the storm that had passed. Something inside him had shifted too. For years, his heart had been closed, locked away behind loss and silence. But Clara's kindness, her strength, and her simple honesty had opened a small door in him again. In the following days, Luke visited the Turner ranch often, helping fix fences and tending to the animals while Clara's father healed. The two worked side by side, sometimes talking, sometimes just sharing quiet moments. Every smile from her seemed to pull him closer to a feeling he had almost forgotten: hope. One afternoon, as they finished mending a fence, Clara turned to him and said with a teasing grin, "You've changed. Mr. Carson, you even look younger." Luke laughed softly, surprised at how easy it felt. "Guess I just remembered what sunlight feels like." She gave him a curious look, then said something that made his heart skip. "You know what to do, cowboy." Luke blinked. "What's that supposed to mean?" Clara only smiled, mounted her horse, and rode off toward the hills, her laughter echoing behind her. Luke stood there watching her ride away, feeling both confused and alive. Those words echoed in his mind long after she disappeared into the horizon. "You know what to do, cowboy." That night, as he sat by the fire in his cabin, he found himself looking at Mary's photograph once more. He traced the frame with his fingers and whispered, "Maybe she's right." Then, for the first time in 20 years, Luke allowed himself to imagine a future that didn't end in silence. The storm had come and gone, but what it left behind wasn't destruction, it was renewal. Somewhere deep inside, the old cowboy's heart had begun to beat again, not just for what he had lost, but for what he might still find. The days after the great storm felt calm, almost peaceful. The land that had been soaked and broken slowly began to heal. Patches of green returned to the hills, and the sound of birds came back to the valley. For Luke Carson, the quiet no longer felt empty. It felt alive. Something deep inside him had changed. It wasn't loud or sudden, but like a soft flame that had finally found air after being trapped for too long. He found himself thinking about Clara often. Her laughter, her fearless way of speaking, her kindness to her father. All those things played in his mind like a gentle song. Luke hadn't realized how much she had become a part of his days until one morning he woke up and felt something missing. It had been over a week since he'd seen her. Her father was healing, and Luke assumed she didn't need his help anymore. Still, he missed her visits more than he wanted to admit. He tried to distract himself with work. He fixed the barn roof, mended a fence, and even cleaned the porch, a thing he hadn't done in years. But everything reminded him of her. The little plant she'd placed near his door was growing strong, and each time he watered it, he thought of her words. Every home needs something green. By the end of that week, Luke couldn't sit still anymore. He saddled his horse, Buck, and rode toward the Turner ranch. The air was warm and full of spring scents, the kind of weather that makes a man feel younger. When he arrived, he saw Clara near the corral, brushing her horse. She looked up and smiled, a light of surprise in her eyes. "Well, look who came riding in," she said, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. Luke smiled back. "Thought I'd check on your father. Make sure he's mending fine." Clara laughed softly. "He's doing better than ever. Been giving orders since sunrise." Mr. Turner, sitting on the porch, waved his good arm. "There's the man who saved us," he called out. "Come on in, Luke. Don't just sit there like a stranger." Luke tied his horse and walked over. The old rancher looked stronger now, his face full of color again. "You brought that storm to its knees, son," he said with a grin. "I just did what anyone would have done," Luke replied humbly. "Not everyone would have ridden into that river," the old man said. Then with a knowing smile, he added, "My daughter tells me you've been helping out a lot lately." Luke nodded. "I don't mind the work. Keeps me busy." Clara joined them, wiping her hands. "Don't let him fool you, Pa. He's been doing more work here than our hired hands." They all laughed, but inside Luke felt something warm spread through him. For years he had lived like a shadow of a man. Now sitting there on the porch with people who welcomed him, he felt human again. Over the next few weeks, Luke spent more and more time at the Turner Ranch. He helped with chores, repaired the barn roof, and even joined them for supper. It felt strange at first. He wasn't used to sharing a table or listening to laughter during meals, but Clara made it easy. She always found a way to fill silence with kindness. Sometimes after dinner, they would sit outside watching the stars. The air would be cool, and Clara would tell him stories about her childhood. The first horse she broke, the time she got lost in the woods, the summer she tried to grow a garden and accidentally flooded the kitchen instead. Luke would listen with a small smile, thinking how her stories made his own life seem less lonely. One night, as they sat watching the sky, Clara looked at him thoughtfully. "You know, you're not what people say you are." Luke raised an eyebrow. "What do they say?" "That you're quiet, cold, and hard to talk to." He chuckled softly. "Well, they're not wrong," she smiled gently. "Maybe they just don't know the real you." Luke looked at her then. Really looked. The moonlight touched her face, making her eyes shine softly. "Maybe I didn't know the real me either," he said quietly. There was a silence between them, comfortable but full of something unspoken. Clara looked away, her cheeks faintly pink, and stood up. "It's getting late," she said, her voice softer than usual. "You should head back before it gets too dark." Luke nodded and stood. Before he mounted his horse, Clara placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you, Luke, for everything. You've done more for us than I can ever say." Her touch was gentle, but it stayed with him the whole ride home. After that night, Luke started noticing how different life felt. He woke up early with a sense of purpose. He repaired the fences not because he had to, but because he wanted to keep things nice. For the first time in years, he wanted his home to look cared for. The cabin, once cold and silent, began to change. He built shelves, cleaned the windows, and even planted flowers along the front porch. People in town started talking. "Luke Carson's turning his place around," they'd say. "Guess that Turner girl's worked some magic on him." Luke didn't mind the teasing. He even laughed when the storekeeper joked about him buying sugar and flour more often, things he used to ignore. Then one afternoon, while he was painting the fence near his barn, Clara rode up again. She looked around and smiled in amazement. "You've changed everything," she said. "It looks like a whole new ranch." Luke wiped his hands and smiled. "Just thought it was time to fix what's been broken too long." Clara nodded, then walked toward the porch where the new flowers bloomed. "You're changing, Luke, you know that, right?" He shrugged lightly. "Maybe I just needed a little reminder of what life's supposed to feel like." She laughed. "And who reminded you?" He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes warm. "You did." For a second, she didn't speak. The wind blew gently through her hair, and the silence between them was filled with something tender, something almost spoken, but not quite. Then she smiled again, playful as ever. "You know what to do, cowboy." Luke blinked, confused yet curious. "You keep saying that." "What do you mean?" Clara mounted her horse, her laughter light as music. "You'll figure it out." Then she rode off toward the hills, leaving Luke standing by the fence, watching her fade into the distance. That evening, Luke couldn't stop thinking about her words. "You know what to do." They echoed in his mind like a gentle challenge. Did she mean he should speak his heart? Or maybe she was telling him not to waste any more time hiding from life. As the sun went down, Luke went inside his cabin. He looked around at the home he had rebuilt and felt proud, but also lonely. The walls were cleaner, the rooms brighter, yet something was still missing. Then he realized it wasn't something missing, it was someone. He looked at Mary's photograph on the shelf, the one he had kept for 20 years. For the first time, he didn't feel pain when he saw her face. Instead, he felt peace. He picked up the photo and whispered, "You'll always be part of me, Mary. But maybe it's time I start living again." He placed the photo carefully back on the shelf and took a deep breath. Outside, the stars had begun to shine. Luke stepped out onto the porch, feeling the cool night air on his face. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard laughter, Clara's laughter, and it filled him with a strange courage. For the first time in 2 decades, Luke felt young again, not because of his age, but because of hope. The kind of hope that doesn't shout or rush, but grows quietly in a man's heart when he finally remembers what it means to live. And as the moon climbed high above the prairie, Luke whispered into the night, "Maybe I do know what to do." The next morning, the first light of dawn slipped through the cracks of Luke Carson's cabin window. He woke up earlier than usual, his heart steady but full of something new. A quiet determination. For years, every day had felt the same. Endless work, empty meals, and long silences that filled the air like dust. But now the silence didn't scare him anymore. Instead, it felt like a moment before something important was about to happen. He got up, washed his face, and looked in the small mirror hanging on the wall. The man staring back at him looked older, yes, but not broken anymore. There were lines on his face from sun and time, but his eyes were brighter than they had been in years. He trimmed his beard, combed his hair, and put on his cleanest shirt, the one he had kept folded for special days but never wore. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say or do, but he knew one thing for sure. Clara Turner had awakened something in him that he couldn't ignore any longer. By the time he saddled his horse, the sun had risen high enough to paint the sky gold. The prairie stretched wide and alive, and Luke felt as if the land itself was welcoming him back into the living world. He rode toward the Turner ranch, the wind brushing against his face, carrying the sweet smell of grass and wildflowers. When he arrived, he saw Clara outside, hanging clean linens on the line. The morning light caught her hair, and for a moment Luke simply stopped to watch. She looked peaceful, strong, and full of life. The kind of person who could make even silence feel beautiful. Clara turned, saw him, and smiled in surprise. "Well, if it isn't Mr. Carson looking sharper than a Sunday preacher," she teased, her eyes sparkling. Luke chuckled. "Figured it was time to look like I belong among the living again." She laughed softly, but her eyes studied him with gentle curiosity. "Something tells me you didn't ride all this way just to show off that shirt." He nodded. "You'd be right about that." Mr. Turner appeared on the porch, leaning on his cane but smiling wide. "Morning, Luke. You here to steal more of my daughter's time?" "Maybe just a little," Luke said with a grin. The old man laughed heartily and waved them off. "Go on then. I can tell this talk don't need an audience." Clara led Luke toward the pasture fence where the breeze was softer. They stood side by side for a moment, neither saying anything. The silence between them was comfortable, like they both knew this was a moment they would remember. Finally, Luke took a slow breath. "Clara," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "For 20 years I've lived like a ghost out here. I thought my life was done. But you came along and reminded me what it means to live again. You brought laughter back into my days." Clara looked at him, her expression soft and sincere. "You've done plenty yourself, Luke. You've brought peace back into our home, helped my father heal, and made this ranch feel alive again." He shook his head. "Maybe so. But I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." Clara tilted her head slightly. "What's that?" Luke looked at her with eyes full of honesty and warmth. "I don't know what the future holds. I'm no young man anymore, and I've made peace with that. But if there's still a chance for a man like me to start again, I'd like to start with you." The wind paused for a moment, as if the world itself was listening. Clara didn't speak right away. She looked down, smiling shyly, then back at him. "You really took your time, cowboy," she said softly. Luke chuckled, the sound low and full of life. "Guess I needed a little push. You kept telling me you know what to do. Well, I finally figured it out." Clara smiled, her eyes shining. "So what now, Luke Carson?" He reached out, gently taking her hand. "Now I stop waiting for life to happen and start living it, with someone who makes me remember why it's worth it." She didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand gently and said, "Then don't waste another 20 years thinking about it." They stood there under the open sky, two souls who had both carried burdens, his of loss, hers of responsibility, but now, in that quiet moment, both had found something simple and pure: belonging. In the days that followed, everything seemed to change on Luke's ranch. The once empty cabin now echoed with laughter. Clara often rode over to help with chores, though they both knew it wasn't the work that brought her. Luke fixed the broken porch, painted the shutters, and even built a small flower garden where her favorite daisies grew. Neighbors began to notice the difference. At the general store, one man whispered to another, "Did you see Luke Carson smiling again?" The other man grinned. "Not just smiling. He looks 20 years younger." "Guess that Turner girl worked herself a miracle," said the first. Luke didn't care what folks said. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to hide from happiness. Clara's visits became more frequent, and each time she left, she would look back from her wagon with that same teasing sparkle in her eyes. The one that said, "You know what to do, cowboy." One warm evening, Luke invited Clara and her father to supper at his place. It was the first time in decades he had cooked for someone else. The table was simple: fresh bread, roast chicken, and sweet tea. But the laughter that filled the small cabin made it feel like a feast. After dinner, Clara walked out onto the porch looking up at the stars. "It's so quiet out here," she said softly. "I used to think quiet meant lonely, but now it just feels peaceful." Luke joined her, standing close enough to feel the warmth of her shoulder. "That's how it feels when you're with the right people," he said. She turned to look at him, her eyes gentle and deep. "You really have changed, Luke," he smiled faintly. "You made it easy." Clara laughed lightly, then looked out at the open land again. "You know, Pa says he hasn't seen you this alive since before I was born." Luke took a deep breath, looking at the horizon. "That's because for the first time in a long time, I'm not living in the past. I'm living for what's in front of me." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The night air was cool, the stars bright, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. Then Clara reached for his hand, and Luke didn't hesitate this time. He held it firmly but gently, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. Weeks turned into months, and life settled into a new rhythm. Luke still rose early to work the land, but now he looked forward to each sunrise. Clara often helped him with chores, and her father began calling Luke son whenever they met in town. People whispered about the two of them, but Luke didn't mind the talk. He had learned that when happiness finally finds you, there's no reason to hide it. One afternoon, as the sun began to set over the rolling hills, Clara rode over like she always did. Luke was sitting on the porch polishing his saddle. She tied her horse and walked up the steps, smiling. "I have news," she said cheerfully. "What kind of news?" he asked. "Pa says I should take over the new section of our ranch. He says it's time I start building something of my own." Luke's eyes softened. "That's good news, Clara. You've earned it." She looked at him thoughtfully and said, "I don't want to build it alone." He looked at her, unsure what she meant. "What are you saying?" She smiled, her eyes steady on his. "I'm saying maybe it's time we stop pretending we're just neighbors." Luke stared at her for a long moment, then laughed quietly, his heart full. "You're a brave woman, Clara Turner." "And you're finally a brave man, Luke Carson," she said with a grin. That evening, as the last light of day faded, Luke and Clara stood together on the porch. The land stretched endlessly before them, peaceful and alive. Luke put his arm around her shoulders, feeling her lean into him. "Hard to believe 20 years went by like a blink," he said softly. Clara smiled. "Sometimes it takes 20 years to be ready for the right moment." He looked at her, then at the stars above. "Guess I finally figured out what to do after all." Clara chuckled gently, resting her head against his shoulder. "You sure did, cowboy." And as the wind moved softly through the grass and the sky turned deep blue, Luke realized that life, no matter how long it takes, always gives a second chance to those who are brave enough to take it. He had spent 20 years in silence, but now his heart was full of laughter again, and this time he knew it would never go quiet.